So today we have from the University of Montana, Dr. Jakki Mohr. And Jakki teaches marketing at the University of Montana in Missoula, and has gotten her BA from Boise State University, an MS in marketing from Colorado State, PhD in marketing from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Worked in Silicon Valley for a number of years, and has been a leader in teaching in high-tech marketing. All those things aside and all the other accomplishments that she's done, I think the most important thing she ever did was she taught me. I was in her MBA class in high-tech marketing. And so, maybe you've done more important things, but, one of the things I told in earlier classes, although Jakki didn't remember this, but at midterm, she did this, she had this exercise where you had to come meet with the professor, and she was going to tell you about how you were doing in the class and what you were getting for participation. And she told me I was at a 4 out of 5 for participation. And I was angry. I was like, I'm coming to class, I'm reading everything, I'm trying to add questions, I'm just so interested in what we're talking about. I can't find myself to get into the conversation. And so from then on, I was like, I'm going to interrupt her if I have to make sure I say something in each and every class. So one thing she really values is to have some participation. So, hopefully some good questions come up as we go through this, and that you think about at the end. So we'll make sure to leave some time for questions. One of the things that I did about 3 years ago was I partnered with a guy who just retired named Ernie Heater. Many of you probably know Ernie or recognize the name. And Ernie was going to wanted to team teach a course in sustainable enterprises, looking at what are businesses doing in sustainability. And so the first thing I did, like any person would do, is I emailed my mentor. I emailed Jakki and said, Jakki, I'm going to be teaching this course. We're going to develop it from scratch. It's going to be really exciting. What do you know? Do you have any good resources? And she said, you should look at the field of biomimicry. And I thought, I've never even heard of this before. And ever since then, I've been really fascinated by this. I've seen Jakki talk a number of times, and I was on a committee where we were trying to say, how could we bring someone who could blend multiple disciplines in the area of sustainability? And we thought Jakki would be an excellent candidate since this weaves in so much science and biology and marketing and business together in many different ways. And so I'm excited tonight to introduce Jakki Mohr and hear her talk just one more time. So please welcome Jakki.
I opened the window because the first thing I thought is you cram a bunch of bodies into a room like this and it's going to warm up really quickly, so maybe we'll be able to keep it open, I'm not sure. Thank you for that kind and generous introduction, Steve. It's really been my pleasure to be here all day. I have to tell you that I didn't know very much about St. John's University and St. Ben's before I came here. But most speakers who really take their speaking seriously like to do a little bit of due diligence, is what we call it, and kind of check things out in advance. And of course, I knew that Steve's been here for a number of years on the faculty teaching. But what has really inspired me about being here is a couple things. First of all, I didn't realize the extent to which there's such a strong heritage of St. John's and St. Ben's in terms of this connection to the land. And today, when I went around the Arboretum and saw all the things that happen from the, I've now learned that maple sugar is not a noun, it's a verb. You do maple syruping. It's syruping. I've never heard that used as a verb. The beauty of the lake with the activities that were going on yesterday, it was such an amazing day. A lot of the artifacts that I see in the halls in terms of the nature-based artifacts. And so this connection to the heritage and the earth and the beauty, the physical beauty of their surroundings is something that I too really value. So being here is pretty nice in that regard. The other thing that's really impressed me is just the quality of the student body. I mean, there's a lot of energy going on here. I talked to a young freshman. I don't know if he's here in the room. I'm trying to look around today. He was already coming in with his business idea for his entrepreneurship program. And I've talked to students who are engaged at different levels of the program, and the questions have been great. And so I feel like, oh my God, you know, people have told me the leaders that come out of St. John's, and I feel like I'm looking at, and St. Ben's, and I feel like I'm looking at that set of leaders right now. So I'm hoping that in my talk today that I continue on kind of your trajectory of inspiration, the connection that we all have with the land, and part of the reason that we're here. And as Steve said, the talk that I'd like to share with you is some of my research on this field of biomimicry. How many of you have heard of biomimicry before coming to this lecture tonight? Okay, 2 people in the back, one of whom is actually at the Arboretum and does K-12 education that includes biomimicry. So it's kind of interesting that from my perspective in business, biomimicry is considered to be a movement, but nobody's even heard about it. And this room is not alone. I mean, most people say, oh, what does that really mean? Is that like mimicking birds when they fly, when the Wright brothers created airplanes? And it's like, well, no, that's not quite it. So I'm hoping tonight that you learned 3 things from this talk. One is that you can actually articulate what is biomimicry. 2 is you can think about how you might use this field of biomimicry in your own lives, whether you're a business person, whether you're in political science, whether you're in geography, whether you're in one of the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, or math. Because I really believe it has the possibility to really change the way we make decisions as leaders of the future. And then the 3rd thing that I hope you take away is actually just some cool, interesting examples. And I think if you're, you know, coerced into coming to an evening lecture, that at least there's something in it that you think, yeah, that was actually pretty cool. I think that I want to hear a little bit more about that. And so I'll give you a few resources as I go through my talk too, just in case that cool factor is something that it resonates with you, and I really hope that it does, because it certainly does with me. Okay, so what are we looking at here? This bird is a kingfisher. Do you have kingfishers in Minnesota? Yes. Okay, and what is one of the hallmarks of a kingfisher from a biology perspective? From a biology perspective, we have an organism that moves from one density of medium, the air, into the density of another medium, the water, without making any sort of a ripple or a splash. And the genetic reason for that, of course, is when they dive to catch the fish, they have to be able to see, and if you've stirred up the water, you can no longer see it. So what do we have here? We have the bullet train in Japan, and the example that I'm sharing with you right now is from I would call her the grandmother of biomimicry, the field. Her name is Janine Benyus. She actually lives in Montana in the Bitterroot Valley, and the way that I even became familiar with this is I went to an evening lecture one night on campus, and I heard her speak, and I was just instantly mesmerized. And so since then I've tried to figure out how I could bring the power of this field into my own life. So what we have here is the bullet train in Japan, and obviously the bullet train goes so fast that when it was initially running at the outset, it created these huge sonic booms as it went through tunnels. And sonic booms essentially occur because they're pushing out all the air through the tunnel, and it makes this huge whoosh from the displacement of the air. Did you like my sonic boom? Okay, and so when the engineers were told they needed to quiet the train, engineers typically are trained with a particular toolkit that they learn. So for example, I work a lot with electrical engineers. They learn a discipline called quality function deployment, and I can talk to you about Kano concepts and all these tools that they have, but one tool that they don't have in their toolkit is how would nature solve this problem? So if you went to a biologist and you said, what organism in nature essentially has to move from one density of medium to another without displacing or disrupting the two mediums? And a biologist would say, well, the kingfisher is one such organism. So the way that this was done is by rounding the nose of the bullet train. Essentially, it allowed the displacement of the air without the sonic boom. And this might be, a very simplistic example. This is one example of biomimicry, and it's called Bioinspired design, where we look at the design of the organism and we mimic that in some human-designed product. And bioinspired design is the simplest level of biomimicry because what we're mimicking is the form of the organism and not necessarily the function per se. And I'm going to differentiate between those two things in a minute here. Now, the unexpected benefit of the quieting of the sonic boom was actually just the rescalloping of the nose of the bullet train actually resulted in a huge increase in fuel efficiency, which in hindsight seems logical. But if it's so logical, why have train engines always been designed to be flat on the front? I mean, think of the trains that you see, right? And so some of these things that we take as being, well, no kidding, they're not as obvious to the designers of the products as they are to the biologists, because otherwise we wouldn't have all of the problems that we have with some of the designs that we do. Does that make sense when I say it that way? Okay, so let's get into talk a little bit more. If I can figure out how to work my little arrows here. You would think that one arrow goes one way. All right. It was on. Steve and I tested it earlier. Okay, so you're sitting there. Do you mind advancing my slides for me? Up arrow, down arrow. You're now my assistant. Thank you. It's a lot of pressure. Okay. So I want to talk about what is biomimicry? Why is biomimicry starting to be used in business more? And as Steve said, I'm a marketing professor. I'm going to give you some case studies, talk about my research, and then have some time for questions at the end. Thank you. All right, so what is biomimicry? The word essentially comes from bio meaning life, and obviously the word mimic means to imitate. And the whole idea of this field is that instead of business people, and businesses are comprised of engineers who develop products or mathematical algorithms, architects who design buildings, product designers in the R&D process, instead of using their own tools in their toolkit, the tricks of the trade, they actually bring biologists onto the product design team. And in the process of biologists working with engineers, the idea is to create new insights and to generate new innovations. And really, innovations are the lifeblood of our society moving forward. And so I think if there's anything that I would look to you as the leaders of the future to think about is, where are you going to come up with your innovative ideas for the future? And what I would submit to you is that this nature-inspired design is definitely a place where you can find inspiration for innovation. So the formal definition of biomimicry is innovations that are inspired by nature, and that because they're inspired by nature, they should be inherently environmentally friendly. Which, when I use the word sustainable, I do mean environmentally friendly. Okay, there are many different meanings of the word sustainable, and that's what I mean. I do have a book, Marketing of Technology and Innovations, and it surprised me that I was the first author of a business book to actually include biomimicry as a protocol in the product development process. And the protocol that's used is this spiral process, because the spiral connotes lots of things in nature, but essentially it connotes a feedback loop and a learning over time, and it's a highly efficient. How many of you studied the Fibonacci sequence in your math classes? Anybody? Okay, it's based on the Fibonacci sequence for those of you who are math geeks, and I really love math a lot. And so my daughter, who's 17 for her senior project, is actually doing her IB math thesis on the Fibonacci sequence, which I'm so excited to learn more about it. So the spiral process has quite a bit of background in nature, which is why the Biomimicry Institute started with this idea of the spiral. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple examples here. What we're looking at on the left-hand side is the scalloped edge of a humpback whale fin. And what a nature-based biologist would say is, why is the fin of the humpback whale scalloped like that? Why is it not smooth? And the fact is, nature has had 3.8 billion years of evolution to refine organisms in nature to be highly efficient at survival. And what we have on the right-hand side is the edge of a wind turbine. How do most product designers build a wind turbine? It's with a smooth edge. But when a wind turbine actually has a scalloped edge. It actually is able to rotate more freely with a lot less wind force and to generate more energy through slower rotations when there's not a lot of wind. And the inspiration for this came from trying to understand why would the humpback whale have a scalloped fin. So each of these examples is a real product produced by a real company, and some of the resources I'm going to give you, I think the best resource that you can look for some of these examples is a resource called asknature.org, where essentially you can put in your why does nature have brilliant colors in the Amazon? Well, in the Amazon, brilliant colors you would think would attract predators and make it harder to be camouflaged, right? And how do Amazon creatures do that? What is the mechanism by which they create these vibrant colors? So I'm going to come back to this example a little bit, but asknature.org is a very cool website and explains more of these examples. Hey, I just did that on my own, didn't I? Woohoo! Okay. When we talk about how do we harness the energy from the wave, and we study the way that the kelp waves move in the ocean, there is a company in Australia called Biowave that has actually anchored some of these mechanisms on the ocean floor to actually harness wave power, so that in addition to wind power and solar power, we can now get wave power out of the ocean, okay, through mimicking this flow of the kelp that essentially captures that and moves with it very freely. Do you think that's cool? I think it's way cool. Okay, we're looking at a lotus leaf, and the lotus leaf has this ability to bead water. And how do we make fabric waterproof or to shed water? We coat it with chemicals that are highly toxic, including Teflon is actually one of them that's used in this process of coating chemicals. So this is a company in Denver, Colorado called Green Shield, which I think is a lovely name as a marketing professor, that essentially mimics the reason why the lotus flower creates this beading. And when you look at the molecular structure of the lotus leaf, it actually has a very unique bumpy surface. It's not smooth. And what do the bumps do? The bumps force the water droplets to adhere to each other, get bigger, and roll off. So those of you who study the properties of water, who understand why it beads up and how that process works. Kind of like the same thing when we have rainfall from the sky. And by mimicking that bumpy process in the fabric, it creates water repellency with no chemicals. So there's a benefit not only to the consumers who buy it, there's also a benefit in the manufacturing process. Another thing that's interesting about this is it automatically sheds the dirt, so these are less likely to get dirty over time as well. Okay, we have a termite mound on the left, and what you'll find in a termite mound is despite the cold, cold nights in the desert air and the hot, hot days, termite mounds are able to maintain a constant temperature within plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius based on the way that they're designed to circulate airflow. This is a building in Harare, Zimbabwe, and it was designed to mimic the airflow of a termite mound. It uses 90% less heating and air conditioning to maintain a constant air temperature of approximately 80 degrees, which we might think is warm and uncomfortable here, but when you're in sub-Saharan Africa, that actually is something that is very comfortable. Same as in Phoenix, Arizona. You just get used to when it's 100, 80 is actually cool, right? So 80 is very comfortable. Sorry, do you think that's cool or what? All right. Okay, this is a coral reef. It's a brain coral. What happens in the process of making traditional cement? What happens is we produce a ton of CO2 in the actual manufacturing of cement. But if you ask a biologist, how does coral create these strong skeletal structures? And I just feel like I have to say pre-global warming, because we know the coral reefs are being destroyed at a very large rate due to the warming and the acidification of the oceans. But what we know is that in a healthy ocean, this is actually formed from CO2. So is CO2 something that is actually toxic and creates greenhouse gas emissions, and how does the coral do that? Well, by mimicking the building blocks or the recipe for coral a company in California called Calera Cement is now making cement based on the recipe that is mimicked from coral. And in the process of doing that, the company is sequestering CO2 rather than releasing CO2 in the atmosphere. So based on these examples that I've told you, don't you have the logical question in your head right now? Why isn't every business doing stuff like this? And that was the question that I asked in my research. If these are such amazingly inspiring examples, and I can see it in your faces, you're just waiting with bated breath for the next one, why isn't this working in business today? What are the problems? And that is the question that I asked in my research, and we're going to get to that in a minute. Okay, so one more example, back to the Amazon rainforest. How do butterflies create this strong, vibrant color? Think about all your cell phones and your devices that you have here. This is an example that's really near and dear to our heart. Because we're tethered to our mobile devices. And for most of us, the issue is it runs out of battery quickly. And the older your device is, the more quickly the battery runs out. Am I right? It's like, yep, she's singing my song. And how does that work? It's when we're outside. Let me rephrase this. The battery life is drained as we have our display on more. So the display light is one of the major sources of the battery drain. And yet when we're outside, what do we have to do? I was trying to take pictures yesterday. I was trying to shield my display from the sun so I could get my pictures lined up just right. And I took some awesome pictures yesterday of the lake and the leaves and the trees. It was so beautiful. So if you are Qualcomm Technologies, Qualcomm makes the chips inside your cell phone. So most of us know Intel as the chip inside your PC. Qualcomm makes the chips inside your cell phone. Qualcomm says, like Intel does, we could sell a lot more chips if we could somehow get more people to use their devices more, but we have to crack this nut of the battery life and the display. They brought in a biologist to their team, and they said, what organisms in nature create strong, vibrant color with no electricity at all, no electronics? And a biomimic would make a list of organisms: peacock feathers, butterflies in the Amazon, fish in the ocean. And what a biologist would do then is drill down into the specific molecular structure that allows that to happen. So the company that was able to reproduce this strong, vibrant color in an electronic display is a company that is called Iridium Technologies. I love the name Iridium. It has that tech component with iridescent combined. And Iridium was actually bought by Qualcomm because Qualcomm said, we're actually going to go into marketing this new display technology. It has a nice technical name called the IMOD interference display modulator or something like this. I am not an engineer, and those people are not marketers that call things IMOD interference modulators. They're not marketers. You guys were sort of supposed to at least find that a little amusing. Thank you. Okay, and so what we have is, if you go to the Mirasol Display website, you'll see a display of their e-reader that they introduced in Korea. Now the question is, why would they introduce it in Korea? Number one, literacy rate. Number one, deployment of electronics. Number one, academic, educational country. The woman who's going to Laos on her Fulbright is nodding her head saying, yep, it makes perfect sense. And I need to say South Korea, I'm sorry. So South Korea is the correct thing to say. And so they introduced this product called the eKyobo reader. So they partnered with the equivalent of an Apple in Korea and released this. And the beauty of it is when you see their ads on YouTube, you can be in full sunlight on a beach doing anything you want. Your battery lasts forever and it's full vibrant color display through the use of these IMOD interference modulators, which is a horrible name. So Mirasol Display is a much better name. Okay, so the benefits of biomimicry are that these are sustainable technologies. So there's a lot less pollution in the manufacturing process, which is critical. They perform well in terms of their performance attributes, as I've described. And this is based on the 3.8 billion years. The Biomimicry Institute is headquartered in Missoula. It's an international organization. It's recently changed its name to Biomimicry 3.8, meaning 3.8 billion years. You have to explain that to people because most people hear words like 2.0 and 3.0 and they think it's a generation of technology. But in this case, it's 3.8 billion years. Most of these designs save energy in some way, like the mirror cell display, and they oftentimes cut the material cost needed to produce the goods. One of the things I'm most excited about today is actually 3D printing and how 3D printing is using biomimicry to help in honeycombs and structures to create really strong tensile materials that are made out of honeycomb, so it takes a lot less material. So I'm going to explain the mussel shells and the plywood here in a minute, so bear with me on the picture and I'll get to this one. Okay, so if you're interested in more biomimicry benefits, this is from a business perspective. Waste is a big part of business, and if we can minimize waste streams, we can minimize our costs in treating that waste. We can define new product categories and look for disruption. Disruption is a good thing in business because it means you can create a new product category. Companies who are interested in branding, they can actually build a sustainable brand. One of the companies that I follow in Brazil is a company called Natura, N-A-T-U-R-A. It's a women's cosmetics company, and it's all based on biomimicry. So biomimicry is not a United States phenomenon. In my research, I interviewed one of the head agencies in Brazil for the Olympics that are upcoming, is a company by the name of Tatil, T-A-T-I-L. He's trained all of his product designers in his branding agency on biomimicry because he thinks this is just the way business people need to think. So any of the branding that you see for the Olympics coming up in Brazil, his company did all the branding, and you should check out his website, T-A-T-I-L. It's just a very cool website. His name is Federico Gelli, and I can't say his name quite properly, but he was just a really amazing guy to talk to. So I'm going to give two quick case studies about my technology marketing class at the University of Montana and how my students are getting some hands-on work with integrating biomimicry into their business. And they are working with biologists in the course of doing this. So this interdisciplinary interaction is something that's both really expected and really difficult. It's both of those things at once. All right, and I'm not going to go through some of the other things here, but we partner with the Biomimicry Institute. So the first company I'm going to talk about is Sharklet Technologies. Sharklet is based in Denver, Colorado. This is a lovely picture of a boil on a person's skin. I picked the most palatable image that I could find. I found some really gross ones in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this is a boil that is due to a MRSA infection. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is the dreaded MRSA bacteria that is antibiotic resistant. So people go into the hospital to get well, and MRSA is actually killing more people in the United States. I'm trying to remember that it's like then car accidents and something else combined. People go to the hospital, they walk out with MRSA and they die because it's antibiotic resistant. Have you known people that have this problem? Well, I've given this talk a couple times. One woman came up to me and she said, "That happened to my sister." It's like, oh, that's a little too close to home. Okay, so how do we fight infection in hospitals? We take a cocktail of drugs. And we're always asking our physicians for antibiotics, and they're giving us more and more powerful antibiotics. But what happens with bacteria? They mutate, and they can grow faster and smarter than the antibiotics that we have. And think about this. We have multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in developing countries. We have multi-drug resistant HIV infections. I mean, this is not just a MRSA story, okay? This multi-drug resistant problem is because our own human ingenuity has actually created the problem that we're living with now. Does that make sense? So we think we're so smart, but the bacteria are outsmarting us. So here's the bacteria in the petri dish, and this is just meant to symbolize. So we douse it with these really harsh toxic chemicals. And if you work in a hospital or you have people who work in a hospital, you know that they wear plastic and things like that, not only to protect themselves, but because they work with all these toxic things in the hospital all the time, right? So what do? What does a biomimic do? They say what organisms in nature shed bacteria or repel bacteria without needing injections of antibiotics. And again, a biologist can give you a taxonomy of organisms. And this is actually a Galapagos shark that is a slow-moving shark. And why does a shark have denticles on its skin? I mean, how many of you watched the Olympics when they had those, Nike had the swimsuits that had denticles to help the swimmers race faster? Do you remember that? And then the U.S. Olympic Committee changed the regulations and they had to have standard swimsuits for everybody because some people were getting an unfair advantage from that apparel material. Do you remember that? Okay, so this is the same idea. So rather than looking at the denticles of the shark's skin, which is this ribbing of this hills and valleys, and this is what it looks like blown up, when Sharklet decided to create a thin film technology that was not a smooth surface like a hospital bedside rail or a table or a card at a nurse's workstation, when they coat it with a thin film that microscopically has this ribbing, it sheds the MRSA bacteria because the bacteria cannot adhere to and colonize in this ribbed fashion. Is that cool or what? So they're not public yet, and for those of you who are investors who decide you want to buy stock, think about the markets for this. It's not just a hospital market. What happens with the SARS scare? That was an airborne thing, but think about public places, stadiums, airports, schools, education. Why do you have all these signs around here? You know, cough like this, wash your hands. It's because of germs. All we need is Sharklet's product, and we're germ-free. It's not quite that easy, but do you see what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. So, second example. So what do my students do with these companies? What my students do with these companies is a couple things. The biggest problem for these small companies is they lack marketing expertise and they don't know how to market to the customers that they're trying to reach. So in the case of Sharklet, what they wanted to pursue was coating catheters that are inserted into the human body during surgery. But that requires FDA approval. But again, catheter-induced infection is a huge risk in hospitals. And so they couldn't go after catheters first. And so my students were actually instrumental in helping them figure out, until you have FDA approval, what is market opportunity B, C, and D until you get that FDA approval. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so business and marketing has a lot to offer here. Okay, Columbia Forest Products is a company that's headquartered in North Carolina. And what happens with most of these tables like this that are made of plywood, one of the #1 binders in plywood is formaldehyde. And formaldehyde obviously creates a lot of problems, not only in the manufacturing process, but the CDC says that the off-gassing of formaldehyde in our workplaces creates what's called the sick office phenomenon. That people breathe this and you don't feel well and you don't know why you don't feel well, but essentially all of the chemicals that come off our petroleum-based carpet and our formaldehyde in the walls and the paint, I mean, it makes people sick, and it's called the sick office syndrome because of all of this off-gassing. So what do we have here? If we look at how do we make cheap plywood without relying on formaldehyde, and we bring in a biomimic, you say, what organisms in nature create strong adhesive properties without needing chemicals? And again, they'll go make this taxonomy of organisms, and up pops the mussel shell in tidal pools. How do mussel shells stick to the tidal pools? Well, they have these things called byssal threads, and the byssal threads are what allow them to adhere to the rocks. And when you look at those byssal threads underneath a microscope, they have a unique molecular structure. And when that unique molecular structure is mimicked in a soy protein, voila, we can now make wood without formaldehyde based on this soy protein. So the person who discovered this and invented it is a professor at Oregon State University, where they have the Hatfield Marine Science Center, and Columbia Forest Products licensed his technology from the Oregon State University Tech Transfer Office. I don't know, maybe I'm more excited about this than you guys are. Okay. You can buy this product in Home Depot, and And the benefits are not only that it is formaldehyde-free, but it actually has enhanced durability. It lasts longer than regular plywood, and of course it's water resistant because you would expect that. So you guys might be saying, if you're really smart, you're saying, too good to be true, what's the catch? Am I right? How many of you are having this counter argument, like she's proselytizing, she's one of the cult movement people, and you know, she's only giving us one side of the story. Because it's too good to be true. And I'm here to tell you in marketing, too good to be true is not a benefit from a customer perspective because they're waiting for the catch. So in this particular case, this product is more expensive than regular plywood. And the big hurdle that Columbia Forest Products had that they wanted to talk to my students about is how do they market this when it's more expensive? Do they market it as green wood and go after the green building segment and the LEED buildings? Because people are willing to pay more to have green, but only up to a certain point, right? Should they market this through Home Depot, where most buyers are not willing to pay more? They go to Home Depot because they want lower priced goods. It's a business challenge when you have this great product, but it's actually more expensive. So the students actually came up with a metric called total cost of ownership. And what they said is, given how often you might have to replace your deck or your furniture because of warping or unevenness, this has a longer life. It's like the CFLs in our light bulbs. They cost more, but they last longer, right? So it seems really obvious, but when you're a company who's in the lumber business, they don't think like that. So you need these teams of people who can come together, bring the industry-specific knowledge, bring the biology, bring the customer perspective. And it's really difficult to happen. Okay, so these are some companies that have been experimenting with biomimicry. Are you surprised at the list here? Because it's one thing to talk about these small companies like Sharklet, and of course Columbia Forest Products is not a small company. But if you ask these companies, what do they have to show that's successful? Because the big companies have the biggest footprint on the globe, right? So if big companies could do this, we could really change things. And so I have a research project that essentially is funded by an independent agency, the Marketing Science Institute. It's a nonprofit organization out of Boston. So you can't have your research funded by the agency you study because there's a conflict of interest there, right? And so this is funded by an independent agency. And we went in and we studied the companies who are using biomimicry. This is a workshop at Interface Floor. Interface Floor makes a particular type of carpet that is based on sustainable fibers. And what happens in a classroom like this or in a hallway in a hotel, we end up ripping up a whole carpet because we have wear patterns in it, when 80% of the carpet is just fine, right? But we have to rip it up so it matches. So what Interface Floor does is they look at where do we find random patterns in nature that are beautiful. And this seems really obvious again, but if we have random carpet patterns, we can just rip up a square like a tile and only replace the portion that is worn. And so think about this what this means from a business perspective. When you have a manufacturing process, we have this thing called zero defects. We want everything consistent. So Interface Floor goes to their manufacturing people and they say, we don't want consistency anymore. We want total randomization. And what happens to total quality management? The person we interviewed at Interface Floor said they went crazy because what they've been working to do all their life was essentially zero defects. We told them to throw that out and forget it. We want total randomization so we can rip up just these random 12-inch tiles and replace only the pieces of carpet that are worn. And then Interface Floor went one step further, and Interface Floor said, well, customers don't want to have to, replace flooring. What Interface Floor said was, if our big customers like hotels and hospitals and schools that have all this wear on the carpet hire us, we'll actually own their carpet, and that way we can control what happens to it when it leaves the building. It doesn't hit the landfill afterwards, and if we build with the right materials, we can bring it in and recycle it. So they have this cradle-to-cradle process, is what it's called, where instead of going cradle to grave and disposing of it, it's somehow recycled and reused. Now, why is Interface Floor, which is a huge, huge company in Atlanta, Georgia, able to successfully use biomimicry when many other companies are not? So here's kind of the takeaways that we found from our research. First of all, these are some of the students working in these cross-functional teams. The companies that are able to use biomimicry successfully are able to bring the language of biology into their business. So why would Interface Floor be able to do that better or differently than other big companies? It came from the top down. This afternoon I gave a talk on leadership and the vision of leaders. Ray Anderson was the CEO of Interface Floor, and he challenged his people to essentially do no harm. It's almost like the Patagonia of flooring. Okay, you all know Patagonia, they do great things, they have great initiatives. And the leader essentially said, you need to solve this problem because we cannot keep doing business as usual. And so in our study, we set up this acronym called BAU, business as usual, versus companies who were really willing to break the mold. And they all have this senior leader who said, we're going to do it differently. Now here's what's really cool, I think, about Interface Floor. They now have a consulting arm called Interface Raise. I can't remember what Raise stands for. It's not R-A-Y-S. It's not like after Ray Anderson. It's R-A-I-S-E. They will send their team out to consult with your organization on how to essentially replicate what they did successfully. Their first big customer for their consulting was Walmart. And I'll tell you, if Walmart can change its footprint on this planet, things will be very different. Okay, so the success begets success. The second thing about these companies is not only can they bring in the language of biology, but they can also start from the top down. And then the third key piece of it that really makes a difference is how long their time horizon is for success. And this is the big drawback to most public businesses. For those of you in business, you know we have quarterly earnings reports that we have to make, and if we don't make it, the stock goes down and people get very unhappy. The companies that are most successful actually are willing to say, we don't need a new product in 2 years, we don't need a new product in 3 years. We are willing to give this an 8 to 12-year time horizon because it usually takes the product team 2 years to actually figure out how to talk to the biologists. And then we have the material sourcing side of the equation, which oftentimes takes a very long time as well. So companies that don't have a long time horizon, they get fed up after 2 years and they throw in the towel and they say, bring on the next great idea because this one didn't work. They just weren't patient enough. And it takes a lot of courage. And this is what I found in my own work in working with cross-disciplinary teams. You have to be patient to figure out how to listen and communicate with somebody from a different discipline. And that is not easy. My sister got a PhD in chemical engineering while I was getting my PhD in business. And we vowed we would send our semester papers to each other every single semester. And it lasted for 1 year before we said, I have no idea why you're studying what you're studying. I have no idea how to read all the mathematical equations in your chemical engineering papers. And it's like gibberish to me, and we gave up, okay? And that's what happens in a lot of these companies. They just say, the language of a biologist is, how does nature work? The language of a business person is, how am I going to make money? The language of an engineer is, how do I solve this cool challenge because I'm so brilliant, all right? And they just don't connect very well together. Okay, but for the companies that are successful, this is a quote from one of our respondents. This is an amazing mind-shifting experience. It's totally game-changing. Simply learning about it and asking the questions, how would nature do this, catalyzed us to action. And one person said it's like putting on new glasses, that once you can see the world with new glasses, you can't take them off because everything seems kind of fuzzy or different. So really, the companies that stick with this, I think, have a lot of promise, but it requires this embracing of this ambiguity. There are a ton of resources out there on biomimicry, and this is Janine's book, Innovation Inspired by Nature. The one I have on my desk right now is called Learning from the Octopus by a guy named Rafe Sagarin. And there's another one called The Shark's Paintbrush, and they both came out in the last year. And they're just, in my estimation, awesome reading. And these are some of the organizations that are doing cool things. I wanted to highlight a couple here. We have MCAD up here, the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. They have a biomimicry curriculum. Okay, very cool. Cleveland Institute of Art and the University of Akron and Case Western University, they are offering the first PhD in biomimicry. San Diego Zoo has biomimicry consulting that they offer. So this is not like some fringe sort of thing. There are biomimicry groups across the world. When I teach in Stockholm, I talk to the folks at Swedish Biomimetics 3000. So when you finally have this lens on, you realize there's a lot happening in this space. Okay, this is a picture of AskNature.org. Kind of shows you how the iMod works in terms of the reflection of the butterfly wing. Oh, I never told you why butterfly wings glow in the Amazon. Do you want to know? Thank you. It's because they have a unique refractive property that reflects the different light rays at different angles. And by mimicking that, it creates the strong, vibrant color. So it's the way it reflects the different rays of the light spectrum, the color spectrum. Do you guys know that? Is it right?
Yeah.
It's like you must know.
Yeah, we learned it in class.
Okay. All right, so here's the end. If you take the time to really immerse yourself in nature and to really look at the lessons that nature has to offer us, whether it's at this really micro level, at the organismal level, or if it's at the ecosystem level, there is so much potential to learn and to be inspired and to have these nature-based innovations. And what I hope I've accomplished tonight in talking to you is the 3 things that I set out to do. What is biomimicry? How does it have the potential to really affect businesses and you as leaders of the future, and hopefully some cool, interesting examples. Did I accomplish those 3 things?
Yes.
Was it not the worst evening lecture you had to go to?